Welcome to the $2,000 water cooling PC, or sub $2,000 water cooling PC. We only spent $1,928. And in part two, we are going to build the PC. Simple as that, right? Wrong. Well, first thing we gotta do, we gotta take this here 3060 Ti and put this water block on it. Got everything I need. Got my little parts tray here for all the little screws. Got my lttstore.com screwdriver. And I've got some scissors to cut up thermal pads. This thing should come with thermal paste, maybe thermal pads, but we have some thermal paste right here. I've got some thermal grizzly in this little tube, so we'll use that. Actually, I've got some thermal grizzly in this little tube too. All right, now we got everything. Let's get started. All right, so what it comes with here, we've got some long screws, we've got a couple of plugs, we've got a nut that's just out on its own. All right, so we got a couple plugs, got some long screws here. We've got some washers and some screws that have springs on them. Those are going to go directly around the GPU's actual main chip. And then we've got a nice little clump of thermal pads here. They all appear to be the same height. So hopefully the water block is designed for them all to be the same height. And then we've got here is our back plate. All right, so we've just got this nice, clean, all black back plate. And then we've got this. This is the water block. Got a nickel coated center and then acrylic on the outside bit. Should be pretty straightforward, right? Let's get our GPU out of here. In case you guys forgot, this is a MSI Gaming X 3060 Ti. Okay. Here we go. Time to void some warranties. Which one should I choose? Take anything else off. We're going to take this back plate off. So these four screws here are going to be holding on the cooler to the PCB. So this cooler down here with the fans. The rest of these should be just holding on the back plate. So let's take those off. All right. So we got all those off. So technically, back plate is kind of loose now. But these are still holding it down. So we'll start backing those off. Oh yeah, it's coming off. There we go. Things connected here. All right, so we got those off. So you can look here and you can see all the different thermal pads. There's some left on here. There's some left on the PCB. So really, we're gonna cut new thermal pads and replace those ones when we put the water block on. So it's just really a good idea to take a little mental picture so you know exactly where to put them all. I mean, it's somewhat obvious, but never hurts. We're gonna remove all these, but we'll wipe it all off with alcohol in a second. Now, it's entirely possible that these thermal pads are the exact same thickness as the new ones, but we don't really want to take that chance. So we're going to replace them anyways, even though they're brand new, and this is a brand new GPU. Okay, so we got all the thermal pads off of here, which is the only side that matters. Now we just got to clean the PCB and clean up all those chips that have a little bit of residue left on them. So we're going to take this, a little bit of alcohol, rubbing alcohol, and just a nice microfiber cloth. Wipe them down. Careful if you have any cuts on your fingers. All right, those look pretty clean to me, so let's start working on our thermal pads. All right, first thermal pad applied, do the rest of them. All right, so it looks like we've got coverage on all the chips that are going to get covered. You can kind of verify that right here. So this strip is going to be here. This big piece is going to be these. This indent in between is going to get those. Then we've got this big long strip here that'll get covered in there. And then we've got this last long strip here that'll get covered right there. That should be everything. All right, last thing we're going to do while we have it in this state is we're going to put some thermal paste on the processing unit. Just going to squeeze a little bit out here just to make sure it still looks like it's in good shape. Had it in my desk for a few months, so just want to make sure everything's all good. A lot of different methods you can use for applying thermal paste. Since I don't have a really good scraper tool to kind of move it all around and flatten it out, just kind of taking this to help get it all spread out and in a thin layer. Got that pretty close. I'm gonna use this nice little card here, smooth it out. Oops, got a little bit on the side, but that's okay. You can clean that off if need be. A little more, and that should be more than enough. You don't want to put too much to make sure that everything's lining up okay. There we go, now the backplate came off. Now we can install this. Okay, all those holes appear to be lined up. Check the back side now. Not touching anything important. Pretty close to lined up there. Key thing, we're gonna hit these 4 holes. Our new screws. Here on the back plate, there's no holes on the back plate. So we do have to put these screws in first before we can put the back plate on. All right, so we got that one started. So now what I wanna do is take some more of this thermal pad and apply it in the exact same method that we had here. So we had one covering these 3 chips here, one covering all these little chips here. We don't have anything wide enough to do that, so we're gonna have to just cut strips off of this. Oh, actually we might need to reuse those. These thermal pads look like they're gonna be way too shallow. You might be able to tell here in the camera. Those thermal pads are really thick. They look like they have foam in the middle. Let's see if we can maybe repurpose those. Go back to my handy dandy piece of paper here. Now this might not be an ideal implementation for these, but it should still be pretty good. Better than nothing there at all, which this water block kit doesn't supply anything, so they're probably not creating that much heat, but we have the ability to do it, so let's do it. All right, let's get some of these screws started on this other side. Looks like I actually need to put this on before I can touch the back plate. Use a couple of the bolts that came with it, because these are actually threaded all the way down to the head, whereas the ones that come with the water block are not. All right, we got that one on there. Much harder than I thought it would be. All right, that's secure. Alrighty, that's a water block GPU. On to the next step. All right, so we've got the water block on our GPU. Now it's time to get everything on our motherboard, and then we can start putting stuff in the case. That's a nice looking motherboard. Let's get those peels off. All right, so we got that out. Let's get our CPU in there. CPU installed. Let's put our CPU cooler on. And that thing looks huge. Check that out. And it comes with pre-applied thermal paste too. Nice. One of the really nice things about this specific CPU cooler block is it's specifically designed for this AM4 chipset, so it just goes straight on. Pull off these extra brackets, put this on, and you're done. Interesting that they're all completely thumb screws. There's no way to use a screwdriver on these at all. Seems like it's sitting way off the motherboard, but it does seem to be getting contact with the CPU. It's kind of hard to tell, but it's on there pretty well, so I guess we're good to go. Get this heatsink installed as well. SSD installed. Some chunky RAM. Okay, so we've got everything sitting on our motherboard now. We can now get our case out and start putting everything into the case. First thing I'm going to do on this case is pull off side panels and the front panel. I think now is a good time to show you guys the configuration for this build. So we're going to have a 240 millimeter radiator up front, another 240 millimeter radiator on top. Our pump and reservoir combo is going to go right here in the back, and then we'll have the standard GPU location and hopefully tubing to everything. So we'll start like we start every build. Get the motherboard in here. Let's get the motherboard fully installed here. All right, we've got our motherboard installed. It's all tightened down. I'm going to run all of the main case connectors in, and then we'll start putting other stuff in. USB 3, check. Front panel connectors, check. All right, so these front case fans that came with it are going to be our CPU fans. So the motherboard is going to read these front 3 as CPU fans. The reason why having some fans be connected to the CPU port is your motherboard might not post correctly or might not boot into Windows correctly if you don't have anything connected to the CPU fan port. So this is from our CPU cooler block. This is going to control the RGB for it. So we can either connect this directly into our iCUE Commander Pro, or we can plug it in here and use the 3-pin 5-volt connection. Since we've got the Commander Node Pro, we're going to use that. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start installing the radiators in here. In order to install those radiators, I've got these screws from EK. Interesting, so these are M3 by 35. These are M3 by 30. So I'm guessing if you have extra thick fans, you can go with the 35 millimeter screws, but you should be able to just go with the 30 millimeter screws for most applications. All right, so let's install our front radiator first. I'm going to put it with the tubes on the bottom. That way it'll be easier to drain if we need to. I think the bottom tubes here are going to be the low point in our system. Give you this little pull tab to pull the protective piece off the screen. Well, the pull tab came off and the protective bit stayed on. It's actually got dual screens, so I guess you can have whichever side of the radiator facing outwards. So this also comes with a little 3-pin connector. Yep, so we just run this to any fan port. I guess first I should install screws on the current fans. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull off one of these screws at a time. We'll double check the length. That's perfect. See, from that top view, that screw's sticking out quite a bit, so we'll be able to use these 30 millimeter screws. Once I get a couple of these bolts started, I can basically just take all the rest of the bolts in these fans out and install all the new ones at once. Do one more on the bottom side here, maybe this bottom corner. I'm going to take all the rest of those bolts on that are original screws that are holding these fans in and replace them with these bolts that'll go through to the radiator. The bolt heads are so small and these slots are so big that the heads are just going right past them. So I'll have to take these all back out and put washers on them. That's not a big deal. All right, radiator number 1 installed. All right, so we got our PCIe connectors here. So far, we've only got one SATA power that we're requiring, and I think we'll have one more for the Commander Pro. Maybe one more for the pump. I think it'll just be those two, though. So we'll stick with one of these cables for now. All right, the back is looking a little spaghetti-like, but let's get CPU power in and our motherboard power in here. All right, CPU power, motherboard power are also connected. Everything's in there. All right, got the back cleaned up just a little bit. Still got some open connectors here that are going to need to get plugged in. We still got our GPU cables here and our SATA power cable here. But we can button up the front at least. That can go back on. Nothing else we got to do up there. At least look a little bit more complete now. All right, we're going to see if this works. I cut down the length of a couple of these. It should be more like 20 millimeter bolts now instead of 30. And if I can get the threads to not gum up, we should be good. Oh, yeah. All right. Got that one installed. Alrighty, you can see we've got both the top and front radiators installed now. Get on to the next piece. Got to put our pump res combo back here. This thing is huge. Looks like it fits though. Okay, so you can bolt it directly to a 120 millimeter fan. So technically I could put a 120 millimeter fan here and then put this over the top of that. Although I think instead what we'll do is we'll take those original 2 case fans that we were going to use on top. We'll stick them here. We'll do a push-pull configuration on this front radiator and try and push as much air in as possible. Create some positive pressure in the case, and that'll help vent air out. So let's mount this bracket to our pump res, and then we'll mount the whole thing to this case. All right, so pump res combo is in. All of our hardware components are now in besides the GPU. We'll have to route these cables out of the way, add those front fans in, then we'll finally put the GPU in and put in our power cables. Cables in the back now. Let's put our 2 front fans in. Okay, let's get our GPU in here, and then we'll start running the rest of our couple of power cables. One thing I love about water blocking a GPU, you almost never have to worry about sag. It's so nice and stiff throughout the entire structure, and then once you add in the coolant lines, man, there is no sag whatsoever. It's amazing. All right, and this is going to control some RGB on the GPU. We'll just run that to the back. Not the most beautiful GPU power cables ever, but we can clean those up a little bit. All right, GPU power is in. Really, the next thing we're going to have to do is get some cable management going in the back. Then we'll start planning out all of the runs for our hard lines. All right, I've now done all the cable management on here and put the back on, so you'll never be able to see it. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. We could probably go from this port here right down to this port, but unfortunately, it's such a tight turn that we wouldn't be able to make it. So we're gonna have to go to the far fitting there. It's also gonna have to come towards the opening of the case here because these don't line up vertically. Similarly, when we come out of the GPU here, gonna have to go this direction and towards the back of the case in order to hit the port on the bottom of this radiator. Once we get out of this radiator, we're gonna have to come out. We'll go up, out again, and then make a turn onto the CPU cooler block. We'll have to do something similar here. We come out of the CPU cooler block, forward, up, and hopefully we don't have to go back at all. We should be able to plan that right. We can go straight up on the port on the top radiator. And then after it goes into the radiator, we're gonna have to do one last run that comes out of the radiator and all the way over to this pump res combo again. The last thing that we'll have to think about is where we wanna put our drain port. The easiest way is probably to put it down here on this radiator because that's the low point in our system. So you'll get draining from both sides of the loop if you put it at the bottom of there. It's time and some tubes. You'll see here I've added in a fill tube to the top of this reservoir. I had to take off the entire top of the case to do that. So hopefully I'll be able to get it back out. All right, let's start getting some bends. And in order to do that, we're gonna need to get this guy out of the way first. Make room for this. This is an entire custom liquid cooling kit from OC Cool, aka Alpha Cool. Let's get to cutting stuff. Really cool part about this kit is this right here. This is a bending table, so I can lay out the path of my tubes on here so that I can bend them and set them essentially into like a mold so that it's all nice and accurate. All right, so I cleaned up just a little bit so that I could show you guys final product. Pretty much every single tube was 3 bends. So the last thing we need to do before we fill up this loop with water is we need to do a quick pressure test. So I'm gonna remove one of these plugs and we'll run it up. So this is just a hose here. That's gonna connect to my pressure gauge here. And then we have a small pump. We're gonna use this to pressurize the loop, and that's really all there is to it. We're gonna put it up to about 0.3 bar. We're gonna hope that none of the fittings pop out and that we don't hear any leaks. Okay, so all I did was go through and tighten all these fittings a little bit more. There was 1 or 2 that felt just a little bit loose. Now that I've done that, we're actually starting to hold some pressure here. So we're gonna run it up to between 0.3 and 0.4 bar, and then we'll let it sit for a little while and see if we're noticing any leakage. It seems to be holding pretty well, but we'll let it sit for several minutes and see what happens.
A few moments later.
All right, well, after some fiddling, we finally got the pressure to stabilize, so we're ready to fill it. The next thing we're going to do is we'll pull the motherboard power cable out of the motherboard and plug that into something that will essentially short it so that we can provide power to the pump and start filling the loop. Okay, so I was able to unplug the motherboard power cable from the motherboard and put the short on it and fill up my fill bottle here, and we can start filling it up. This is just distilled water, by the way. It doesn't have any sort of contaminants in it or bacteria, which is why it is perfect for use in your computer. There are also additives that you can use to avoid any sort of bacterial growth within your PC, but this is going to be kind of a short-term solution, and then later we'll add in some of those additives once we've run this for a day or two. And now begins the slow process of filling it. Now, one thing you'll have to do is you need another way for air to come in. The water, as it comes in, needs to push air out. So you're going to have to provide an escape method for the air. All right, we're ready to turn the pump on and start filling the loop. You can see over here, we're already starting to fill it up. It's at the bottom of this tube now. Now you can see that the loop is mostly full. It's really loud because the pump's on full speed, but you can look at most of these tubes and there is some air bubbles going through at the moment, but they're mostly filled up at this point. So I'm going to let it run for a little while and try and get as much of that air out, which I can see what the level in the reservoir looks like after that, and then we'll fill as needed. At this point, we're pretty confident in the loop. It's pretty much all the way full, so I took the fill tube out. And you can see that all these tubes are mostly full with maybe just a little bit of air bubbles in. The next thing to do is sit and let this run for about 24 hours, and then we will drain it all out and fill it back up, and then it will be good to go. Okay, so we have now purged most of the air out of our cooling system. We've run it for a significant period of time to help get all of the air bubbles out, and we've replugged everything back in and put the RAM back in. I put the motherboard power connector back in. I had to take the RAM out in order to take the motherboard connector back out. I didn't want to break it. And we're ready to fire this thing up. So let's see if it posts. We're going to swing this around so you guys can see if it posts or not. This is the absolute first try. I have not tried this before to make sure that it would work so that it works in the first time on the camera. We haven't tried this yet, so we're going to see what happens. All the fans seem like they're on. Got everything lighting up. We've got some movement on the motherboard so far, but I've got the green boot light. See if it starts advancing through. Oh, hey, there we go. We detected a new processor going through the boot process because it does have a new processor and new RAM that it's never had on there before. It's going to do some initialization stuff before it finishes up and actually boots into the BIOS. So this might take about a minute before it starts. So you need to hit F1 to run the setup, and then it will actually boot. Right into the BIOS on the first try. Yeah, we spent maybe after all of the water and stuff, probably about $1,960, $1,970 total on this build. As you can see, we filled the whole loop and have successfully posted it to the BIOS. So in the next video, we're going to show you what it looks like completely stock, what kind of performance benchmarks we're going to get both in the CPU and GPU and maybe in game. And then we will overclock it and show you how much more performance you can pull out of a fully water-cooled system compared to something that's stock with air cooling. So make sure you tune into the next video because it's going to be amazing. You're going to get to see some really, really cool performance out of this. And we'll even benchmark it against another build that we have coming up with the same CPU and the same level of GPU. It'll be another 3060 Ti. So that'll be a really cool benchmark to see a standard build versus something like this, where yes, it's a lot of extra time and effort and money, but you can really see what kind of more performance you can get out of the exact same components just by water cooling it. Make sure you like, subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed the video.